So let's go into more detail about how our brains develop. From the moment we're born, our brains are taking in information from the world around us. Now, despite having miniatures of every other limb and body part, our brains are not fully developed when we're born. The full development of our brains is still occurring up until we're 25 years old. Now, what's really interesting is that at birth, the networks in the right brain hemisphere are more highly developed than the networks in our left brain hemisphere. You'd think they'd be at least equal in development, right? But they're not. We've probably all heard neuroscientists and psychologists metaphorically describe the left side of your brain as the analytical brain, where we solve problems, think critically, discern fact from fiction, and organize things into categories and quantities. It's the voice in your head that continually references the past and the future and scrutinizes your every thought and move. And the right side of the network is where we're more artistic. It's our source of play, imagination, and where we process and manage emotion. It's all about the present moment, what's happening now. In actuality, brain scans verify that both sides can have some network activity during any or all of these operations. But if you can't stop thinking about the future or the past, or if you struggle with emotional experience or empathy, you may need to spend more time in and strengthen the pathways of your right hemisphere. That's what's meant when someone says, spend more time in your body or senses, or be more in the present moment. This is just using different language to say, strengthen your underutilized and less active right hemisphere. But there's something I want to point out that I feel is really important about the networks on the right side of the brain. The right brain has connection to the body through the branches of the vagus nerve. And it also has many connections to the limbic hub of the network, or what we call our emotional centers, which we'll talk about more in a minute. So our right brain is what allows us to connect to or feel the emotional landscape of another person. It's where we process facial expression and tone to interpret an experience, and where we can learn empathy. The right brain is also where we pick up nuances in language and get our overall grasp on reality. In other words, the right brain processes in images and generalities and is able to translate and connect to energy. We're all energetic beings at core, and this isn't a religious or philosophical bias, it's scientific fact. We won't go into it here, but when scientists break down the cells that make up our body into their smallest form, it's energy. And in certain states, energy can hold together to make a more solid form, like our bodies or our brains. But nonetheless, your right brain is metaphorically the receiver or the translator for this energy. It's the liaison, the half that picks up on the energy of other people or reads them. For example, as I'm talking to you right now, the networks in your left hemisphere may be deciphering my exact words, the language, and my sentence structure. But the networks in your right hemisphere are picking up on my tone, assessing my facial expression, trying to decipher what I'm relaying behind my words. Does she believe what she's saying? Is she full of crap? Is she telling me the truth, or is she crazy? Now, some people have a very strong or active right hemisphere, but still have difficulty or with their off-center emotional response range, because they can't manage the intensity of their own emotions and they haven't learned how to differentiate what they pick up on. So being around others or in the outside world can be a bit of a sensory overload. In other words, they may be able to pick up on the emotional landscape of another person, but sometimes they're unable to center or moderate their own emotional response to it. But the fact that the right side of the brain develops first in infancy tells us that the foundation of our human life, one of the base layer building blocks, is empathetic, energy-based emotional connection. Otherwise, why would it develop first? Learning technical skills and developing the left brain networks is, of course, important, but connecting emotionally is essential to our species. If we were meant to survive with intellect as part of our foundation, I can't help but wonder why the left brain hemisphere didn't develop equally to the right brain hemisphere. But that's not the case. We developed the right hemisphere networks first because connection and bonding is critical to human survival. Food for thought. So next, let's talk about 3 conceptual systems of the brain, often referred to as the thinking brain, the feeling brain, and the primitive brain. Now, because the brain is highly complex, and we're going to talk more about specific areas in part 3, but because of this complexity, scientists used to conceptually describe the brain as if it was divided into these 3 distinct and competing areas. Currently, that metaphor is used less often as scientists learn about how the brain actually functions. We only have 1 brain, not 3. And the best available neuroscience supports that it functions more like a large network. A network that connects smaller clusters of neurons within it, all of which are designed to function together and as a whole. And from other life experiences, you sort of already know how a network operates, right? We're surrounded by them every day, socially, electronically, and even in our transportation systems. In her latest book, brain researcher Lisa Feldman Barrett does a great job of equating our brain's operation to a global air travel network, carrying electrical signals instead of passengers and efficiently connecting one area of the brain to another through hubs or clusters of neurons. These hubs or neuron clusters may focus primarily on specific processing, kind of like a local airport, but they can also efficiently connect to other clusters to form a larger interactional network. And these hubs are constantly being renovated and updated as we take in new experiences and new information, or as certain routes or pathways get used less often. The neuron cluster or area, referred to as the survival brain, has several functions. Not only is it connected to our feeling brain and our emotional response system to keep us alive, as we talked about earlier, but the survival brain is also responsible for keeping our organs operational and functioning automatically. But for now, let's focus on the neuron hubs that are referred to as the emotional brain and the thinking brain. These 2 brain areas have complementary functions. The emotional brain identifies threat and sounds the alarm. And the thinking brain lets the emotional brain know if the alarm's justified and appropriate. These 2 brain areas can either work together when they're mildly activated, or they can block each other when intensely activated. The point that I want you to get is this: the brain does not fully engage both systems at the same time if one or the other is highly active. I'm going to say that again. The brain cannot fully use your emotion and your intellect at the same time if one or the other is highly active. So what this means is that when we're emotionally activated or highly upset, we won't be able to think clearly, use our intellect fully, or problem solve well, which kind of explains why when we get riled up by some innocent, thoughtless comment, we can never come up with that witty, snarky rebuttal until after we've cooled down completely, right? But the reverse can also happen. If a person spends most of their time in their thinking brain or intellect, the connections in the emotional brain can also become less active, weak, or difficult to access. As example, if I'm deeply engrossed in reading through a research study, say, it's difficult for me to just stop, switch gears, and fully listen with support and love if my husband wants to tell me about his day. Or it's the reason why after work, we sometimes need to kind of unwind and let the connections in our thinking brain cool down before we can be genuinely loving and affectionate with our family or in the mood for anything romantic, right? Now, for some people, overthinking is a coping strategy that was learned in childhood and evolved into a conditioned habit. We're going to talk more about that later. But what I'm trying to say is that some of you may believe that harnessing runaway emotions is the harder task. But for other people, harnessing their intellect and accessing their emotions isn't easy either. In fact, if you've ever known anyone who has experienced neglect or PTSD, a commonly described symptom is feeling a bit stuck in their thinking brain and not knowing how to feel. So, the important piece that I want you to take away from all this is that regardless of whether it's the thinking area of your brain or the emotional area of your brain, prolonged or exclusive use of one or the other adversely affects or weakens the other's operation. So, as we discussed earlier, one of the most important and compounding benefits of brain change work is that it increases our brain's ability to de-escalate or rebound out of that rapidly intensifying emotional brain activation. And this emotional change work differs for different people, depending on which end of the emotional spectrum you experience more often. For some people who are centered in that high right zone of emotion, like I was, self-regulation work may be about toning down the frequency and intensity of high arousal emotion. As an analogy, think of it like learning to turn down the amount of hot water that's running, learning when hot water is really justified, and working your response system towards more often running a bit cooler. While for others who are centered around that low arousal, cooler left zone of emotion, it may be more about turning up the frequency and volume of emotional arousal. Or think of it as training your response system to run a bit warmer more often. So, do you have too much heat in your life and need to cool down? Or is your life a bit cool and perhaps needs to warm up a bit? Either way, self-regulation means learning to shift your emotional state, retrain your stress response system to operate in non-life-threatening scenarios, and safely experience a diverse range of moderate emotional temperatures while integratively strengthening your whole brain. This is one of the reasons that increased body awareness is so important. It's basically training your thinking brain to notice and catch the emotional brain early in its activation before it goes full throttle and shuts down our intellect. If we can catch emotional activation early, when the thinking brain is still available, and delay our behavioral response, we stand a better chance at making wiser, more helpful choices. Are you with me? It's a bit about timing. You may not be able to stop the emotional response from starting or being activated, but if we can catch it early enough by noticing the signs in our bodies, we can use all areas of our brains and make wiser behavior choices. Now, of course, all of this is happening like lightning fast, right? So we need to get really good at reading the signs of early activation in our bodies, because that's pretty much the only thing giving us a clue as to what's about to happen upstairs. Okay, let's do a quick review. The hemisphere that develops first in children is the right hemisphere. This is why children's brains under the age of 7 or 8 have a lot of creativity and imagination, but are not able to discern between fact and fiction or problem solve well. When the thinking brain is fully engaged, the emotional brain is much harder to access. And when the emotional brain is fully engaged, then we can't problem solve well or fully use our intellect. One of the keys to self-regulation is learning to interrupt or catch our emotional brain before it escalates, so that the thinking brain can intervene and help us make better choices. Okay, so are we stretching those brains a bit? But isn't this interesting? So in the next video, we're going to dive into some really cool stuff, like brainwave speeds and how they influence how our brains operate. We're going to talk about how patterns get created, how our brain sees pleasure and pain, and how addiction forms, as well as the differences between different levels of brain operation. But before we continue, I want to pause for a second and give you a simple homework assignment from this section. And the assignment is simply this: pay attention to your body this next week. If someone cuts you off in traffic, or if you feel disappointed, or even when you're laughing at a joke or watching an action movie, notice what's happening in your body. Where do you feel it? Do you feel it in your hands, in your back, or your belly? Is the feeling tingly? Is it heavy? Is it something you can't really describe? That's okay. Just take a few seconds and connect your body to whatever it is that's happening around you. This body sensation identification is going to play a really important role in breaking your unwanted patterns. So you may as well start learning it now. Now, I also want to remind you at this point that you can take this class as slowly as you need to, and you can also pause, replay, and go over the videos again as often as you want, as well as go over the highlighted material in the ebook. If this information is very new to you, the main objective the first time you go through it is simply to take it in, practice some mental flexibility and perspective taking, and consider your brain in a new way. You'll understand the content in more depth by going over it again and then applying it to yourself. Okay, see you in part 2.